Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Criminal Justice Group session this afternoon. My name is Reid. I'm a professional officer and social worker with BASW England. So thanks again for joining us. I'm here with Heidi Dix, who is a director at the Youth Justice Institute, who is going to take us through a presentation this afternoon regarding her organisation, but also her involvement and experience within youth justice. And we will begin our discussion. I'll hand over to Heidi. So I'm very pleased to welcome you this afternoon, Heidi.
Thank you, Wayne. So first of all, thank you to BASW for inviting me here today. A bit about me. I've been a social worker for about 25 years now, and I have worked in and around youth justice for about 20 years. So I started my career working in adult services, which is interesting because quite often people start in children's services and then move into adult services. But yeah, that's where I'm at. And until last week, I had worked for 12 years as a senior lecturer at the University of Suffolk, so a senior lecturer in social work. But I left the university last week, and next week I take up a position as the director of the Youth Justice Institute. So I'll say a little bit about the Institute at the end. Alongside that, I've continued to work in practice. So I work in a youth justice service. I lead a small team to develop and support quality assurance processes and practice development. And the place that social work has in youth justice is something that I've been thinking about for a while. So I feel very privileged to be able to share my thoughts about that with you all today. And I'm really interested at the end. So this presentation will be about 20-25 minutes, I guess. And then I'm really interested at the end to hear your thoughts and your views around social work and the role of social work within this specialist area of practice. For me, one of the reasons that I'm interested in and think about youth justice as a potential social work space that's forgotten about is there is a real policy drive to professionalise youth justice practitioners. And I absolutely support that. And indeed, that's the vision of the Youth Justice Institute. But I also think that social work needs to complement that and not be at the expense of that. So when I trained a while ago now, you had to train as a social worker in order to work in criminal justice. So if you wanted to be a probation officer, you had to train as a social worker first and then go on to do some additional probation work. And it just worries me slightly that, and you will know from your own experiences of working in youth justice, about how many social workers make up your team. So again, I'd be really interested to hear about that because I know nationally there are lots of differences around that. And I often think that social work in this space is forgotten about for a number of reasons. And one of those, I think, is because we sit under the Ministry of Justice. We don't sit under the Department for Education. And indeed, that was one of the recommendations in the care review, wasn't it? That actually youth justice moves to sit underneath the Department for Education, and the government was having none of it. So that's really interesting. And for me, we hear quite a lot about our health colleagues and how challenging it can be to maintain their professional identity when they're working in those health spaces and to really speak up and champion the social work voice. And I often think that this is also the space within youth justice. So anything that BASW can do to help to, one, support social workers who work in this space, and two, to raise the profile of social work, which I know is something that you're interested and passionate about as well, Wayne, I think would be really well received. So just some context then about youth justice as a specialist area of practice. So I just want you to just have a quick read of these and then think about whether you did any of these as a child or as an adolescent. So I'm not looking for any kind of personal disclosures, so you can be as honest as you want to be. And just think about the circumstances that led up to you either being involved in any of this stuff or doing it. So I'm just going to take a minute to pause. Okay, so you probably had a read of some of those. Now, I know for me, when I was having a quick scan about these again today, I certainly can absolutely identify and be linked to at least 10 of these. And so the reason for just kind of thinking about this really is about just reminding ourselves that the majority of the children and young people that we work with will have been involved in some kind of offending behaviour or antisocial behaviour as a rite of passage. And research suggests that most children will grow up and grow out of crime. And I'm sure those of you working in youth justice will know and be familiar with that. So research suggests that kind of behaviour or involvement within criminal justice kind of peaks at around the age of 17, maintains around that, it plateaus a bit in the early 20s and then drops off towards the end. So again, for me, it's about, as social workers, utilising our specialist knowledge and skills and values, exercising our professional curiosity, our reflective skills to undertake these really robust assessments and collaborative planning processes with children and their families, so that we're able to identify those children actually who are not going to grow up and grow out of crime, who may have structural factors such as poverty and racism in their lives that mean that actually that's a real challenge for them, and they're the ones that we really need to be focusing on. There is an argument that youth justice services should work with children certainly at least up to the age of 21, if not up to the age of 25, because of the experiences and knowledge that they have of how the brain functions. That's if you believe in developments in neuroscience. And this argument is largely led by criminologists and youth workers, as well as the campaign to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 upwards. And again, that's somewhere where I'd really like social work voices to be championing this stuff too, alongside our colleagues in criminal justice and youth work. So I took this, indeed some of you may have seen this before, so this was pinned up on a piece of paper on a colleague's wall around the time of the riots, and it really resonated for me because it really brought back for me the idea that every generation really does tend to demonise its youth. So in the 50s we had teddy boys, in the 60s we had kind of the mods and rockers, in the 70s we had the punks. In the 80s, we had, which was my era, we had kind of rude boys, and we had the Reid culture that was blamed for everything. Certainly 90s hip hop was blamed for gangs. And I often talk to students when I was teaching them about what are the subcultures now. And quite often now we know one of the associations is the idea of drill music and the connotations that that has or doesn't have with gangs and county lines. But again, academics, some of you may have come across Dr. Liz Davis. Liz talks about the idea of childism. So she says, in the same way that other isms have, that children are discriminated against in their own right, so that childhood isn't valued. What it is it's seen as a bit of a waiting ground before adulthood. So actually, that's why children don't have lots of rights. And that, again, for me, it's the idea of social work need to champion children and childhood as a right in itself, and not as, as a rite of passage before you move into adulthood. So I think the idea of childism is an interesting one when we're talking about youth justice. So again, I'm sure all of you are familiar and know that yachts were formed following the 1998 Crime and Disorder Act, and the system is heavily regulated. And although those regulations have listed in recent years, we still have things such as our standards for children in the youth justice system. We have some fairly comprehensive, recently revised case management guidance. And it's overseen by the Ministry of Justice. And as I said, I'm not totally convinced that there are some robust links with the Department for Education. We know that government departments quite often don't work seamlessly together, or in many instances collaborate effectively together. So indeed, youth justice services, youth offending services, as they're termed under legislation, were the first true multi-agency teams, I think. So it was bringing together those 5 hard hitters to support children: the police, probation, social care, education and health, all together. And we know that youth justice services now, quite often, many of them work and offer a prevention and diversion service, and as well as working with children who are on court orders. So quite often 50% of the work of many youth justice services are working with children who are either on the edges of criminality, so those prevention and diversion schemes, as well as children who are on court orders. And that's a real shift from 20 years ago, when the predominant pieces of work were working with children on court orders. And again, I'd be interested to hear a national perspective from you and your different experiences of that. So we know those court orders, children will either be sentenced to a community sentence or a custodial sentence. And again, consistently, Ofsted reports over the last few years have been very clear that youth offender institutes and secure children's homes really are not safe spaces for our children. They experience high levels of violence, both from each other, but also through the inappropriate use of restraint from some staff. And there's a great book by Caroline Willow. Wayne and I were just talking about Caroline from Article 39, called Children Behind Bars. I really would encourage you to read that if you haven't already. And Caroline makes the argument that these children are often the most traumatized children, the children who've experienced the most abuse and neglect, and that actually the state, by sentencing them to our current custodial establishments, means that they are being re-abused and re-traumatized. We know from our Ofsted reports that inspections identify that the majority of these children, certainly over 50%, are saying that they are not feeling safe, that they are not feeling warm. So actually their spaces that they're kept in are cold, and they're not having enough food to eat. So for me, there is a big role for social work for advocate for these children, which are quite often hidden. I often think children in custody really are hidden, and social work used to have a space in youth offender institutes by statute, and they don't now. So that's an interesting one in itself. And there is something about the organisational lenses that view children within youth justice. So we know in social work, we're used to working with different organisational cultures. The police have a perspective and a purpose. Health services will have a perspective and a purpose. And there's something about social work quite often that's able to bring all of those together to avoid some confirmation bias that comes when we are just thinking about children from one particular perspective. But there is a suggestion. So I've just spoke about how difficult and how challenging and how abusive actually our custodial establishments are for children. And there is a suggestion that policy is shifting and changing more to a child's rights perspective, certainly at least for children who are sentenced to community orders, less so for those children in the secure estate. And this work is being driven by criminologists. So Stephen Case, Kevin Hines developed a child-first approach to youth justice. And this is the policy that has been adopted and underpins the Youth Justice Board's case management guidance, and that certainly appears in their business plans. And this is based on 4 tenets. So we're talking about current policy directives, which I think is a real shift and is something to be celebrated. But for me, these all link to core social work values. So again, there's nothing new here for us. And in a way, I kind of feel disappointed that social work hasn't led the way with this policy shift, that it is criminologists who have done that. Not that I'm knocking criminologists in any way, but I just think it's such a shame that as a social work profession, we're not leading this stuff. So those 4 tenets are: the idea is recognising children as children. So this is about prioritising their needs, their identities, and also about addressing those structural barriers that may exist. So that's whether that's poverty, racism, but also recognising children as children. So not treating them as adults, and recognising them as developmentally and their maturity levels, rather than just purely operating on a chronological level. It's about constructive relationships. So again, for me, this is about, if we're using social work language, we're talking about co-production here. And it's about focus, well, no, so co-production is next. The constructive relationships links into this, because it's about focusing on where children want to be, their aspirations. So our strengths-based practice is what we would talk about in social work, and not thinking about where children have come from. And again, that's a practice that quite often dominates within youth justice, the idea about what children have done, not what children can be. And then, yeah, the principle of collaborative and co-productive relationships. So it's not just children and families' involvement within their assessments and plans, but it's also about thinking about their involvement within the wider community. So again, within social work, we would talk about and call that systemic practice, helping them to think about the systems around them and then connecting them to that. And then finally, the idea about promoting diversion. So that's about a childhood removed from the system. So really intervening at the lowest level. So again, I think there's a real space for youth justice being separate from social care. But I also think that there are aspects of the work that youth justice do, such as prevention in its own right, that I think better sits with other services. But again, that's that kind of a conversation that we can have at the end. I do think there is a real struggle to operationalise child first principles within youth justice. And that is a challenge when we are working with systems who are not working in that way. So if we're working with the police, if we're working with the courts, who are not recognising these principles and have other priorities and other purposes. So I think that's an interesting one. So who are those children? Who are the children who are in contact with the youth justice system? And this, for me, again, is why I think youth justice is often a forgotten social work space, because these are the children who are in care. These are often the children who are at risk of significant harm and or are children in need. And this is quite often risks outside of the home. Over 50% of children in custody have been part of either a child protection plan or a child in need plan at some time. We know that significant numbers of these children experience drug and alcohol misuse or physical and emotional abuse within their families. We also know that loss and bereavement is an experience for many of the children that we work with. And again, that's disproportionate compared to other children in other social work spaces. These children have significant mental health problems, and there is a real recognition around the reported incidents of self-harm that takes place with children, particularly in custody, but also outside of custody. And there is an increasing recognition of the special educational needs that these children have, including the numbers of children who have difficulties with speech, language and communication. And I know the Communication Trust do some fantastic stuff and offer some great resources to support, again, courts and the systems that work with children in and around youth justice to really recognise and to better understand those challenges. We know that overrepresentation of certain groups of children is exist within this area of practice. So we know that children in care, just talked about that, as significantly overrepresented. We know that girls are and need a very specific response, but we also know that Black boys are, and you know, these are stats that we keep hearing about all the time. Black boys are absolutely 4 times more likely to be arrested than white boys. And we also know that less than half of children, these were the stats from last year, less than half of all children in custody are from a white background. So, you know, disproportionate numbers of Black young men, particularly, who are in our custodial establishments. And we know that this is partly through the ideas of adultification. So Janine Davis and her organisation has been talking and championing about this lots. Those ideas about black boys who are seen in the system as adults and are not seen as children and given the same rights as white children. So theory and practice in youth justice really draws quite heavily on principles in criminology and in youth justice. But I really think that social work has a lot to offer. Social work knowledge, social work theory has a lot to offer youth justice. But I also think that the practice in youth justice has a lot to offer social work more generally. So in my experience, if we're thinking about holding the needs of the children who are in contact with our services in mind, teams are often leading the way in trauma-informed practice, relational practice, which is all underpinned by attachment theory. Indeed, many harmful sexual behaviour services are led and located within youth justice teams. We know again that many youth justice services understood the risks to children outside of the home, so contextual safeguarding, and they were recognising this through their connections with children who were telling them about their experiences of either being sexually exploited or criminally exploited through gangs and county lines. And I know that, again, youth justice teams and colleagues are quite often instrumental in educating and supporting social care staff and our safeguarding colleagues about risks outside of the home. And again, it talks here about disproportionality, but really we're talking about the over-representation of certain groups of children. So Black children, Gypsy, Roma, traveller children, children in care. And for me then, this social work in youth justice really is a social justice issue. And all of these children in care will have a social worker, and they are the ones who also need to be championing and advocating for the rights of these children. Quite often I hear the opposite. I hear colleagues talk about children who are involved in or pushed towards or pulled towards or feel they don't have any other choices to be involved in criminality. And colleagues quite often, still I hear this nationally in different spaces as a lifestyle choice, and really thinking about children as having much more agency, much more choices than they have. So again, I mentioned that assessments within this specialist area practice are very complex. So we need to draw on our professional knowledge skills, our professional curiosity to really work effectively with those children and target those children who are experiencing structural barriers. But quite often these assessments are undertaken by practitioners who don't have professional qualifications. So these assessments are looking at the risks that children pose to themselves, so the safety and wellbeing concerns. We're looking at the safety and wellbeing concerns of public, so children who may pose a harm to others. And we're also looking at reoffending and offending behaviour of these children. And previous focus on assessments was looking at risk and protective factors, so that kind of paradigm. And although that's still a focus in our assessments, practice now looks at things such as good lives model. So it's really thinking about considering that and thinking about children through a trauma-informed lens. And this kind of, from the Children's Society, really summed up for me about the importance of really understanding children's behaviour. So what children are telling us, what messages they're telling us through their behaviour, and then thinking about how that can be channeled in a pro-social way. And we know more about the importance of supporting the development of a pro-social identity. And the idea of an identity lens is based on Neil Hazel's work, who again is a criminologist. And he quite often and his colleagues talk about the need for children to have fresh air. So the air is the activities interactions and roles. Now, for me, this really is old-fashioned community-based social work. And really what we're talking about when we're talking about the children's needs for activities, interactions and roles is the need to provide secure attachment opportunities. And again, for some reason, youth just, well, I know what the my hypothesis for what the reason as to why youth justice has its own language, really, which is kind of separate from social work, is because it draws again on knowledge from criminology, and also from our youth justice and youth work colleagues. And so I think if we just change the language a bit, what we're talking about is social work knowledge. So it's the idea that children need to engage in positive activities, not only to fulfil their time, but also to provide them with a role and a new identity. So are they identifying something that they may be good at and then providing some affirmation in relation to that? So whether that's music, whether that's, you know, something creative, whether that's a sport, whatever that may be, it's about identifying and supporting activities within as a youth justice practice, really. So not just focusing on what are the risks, what are the protective factors, really building in and thinking about, does a child have opportunities for activities? Do they have opportunities for interactions? So we know that our sense of self is quite often shaped by our interactions through others. So if we're continually receiving positive experience, positive affirmations, that's going to build our confidence and shape our self-esteem. And again, we're talking about strengths-based practice here. So again, I think this is something that can be underpinned. We need to think about our use of language when we're talking to children, and it can be undermined by some of our colleagues, again, who consider and blame children. And it's about thinking about the roles that children can undertake. And for me, this is thinking about systemic social work practice. So looking at and thinking about the wider networks around that child, thinking about the systems that operate. So we talk about that in terms of systemic practice. And thinking about whether the role for that child is, are they the funny one? Are they the good friend? Are they a good listener? Or, you know, in my family, I was always known as the bossy one. So whatever that role is, which is a less than kind role, I would say. But it's about, again, as social workers, needing for us to be able to develop and support these connections. So really developing those secure attachments, both within children's networks and also extending their networks too. And at the heart of all social work practice is relationships. And so this really is true within youth justice. So this, many of you may have seen this if you're working within youth justice. This forms part of the Youth Justice Board's case management guidance. It's still in the new revised youth justice guidance, and it's kind of linked to the Institute. And I'm really interested in relational practice. So a few years ago, my colleague and I looked at what the evidence suggested was effective for youth justice practitioners. So what was it they needed to be? What was it they needed to know in order to affect positive change? And we quite often hear practitioners talk about the importance of building relationships. But what do we then do with those relationships? How can we utilise that relationship as a mechanism for change? And so my kind of contribution to this framework was really thinking about the values aspect. How do we need to be able to affect positive change and work effectively with children and families? And again, I talk about the language of youth justice, but for me, this language, when we look at those values, absolutely supports social work values, because of course, that's what I drew upon. So the idea of non-blaming, being non-judgmental, the idea about, as practitioners, we need to be optimistic and hopeful. So again, research suggests that we're working with children, one of the things that we can do to affect change is to absolutely believe that children have the capacity to change if they choose to do so. So that links into our strengths-based, future-focused practice. It's about the importance of being open and honest, and this links to the collaboration around that, and also the need for us to be and display empathy. And that's, for me, is about the need for us to be able to develop trust. So drawing really on both traditional values, which are there, but also emancipatory values we have in social work. So in terms of being non-blaming, it is about then non-judgmental, and also then thinking about and addressing those structural barriers. So I'm guessing for most, if not all of you, the stuff that I've been talking about here really isn't new. But I really welcomed the opportunity to share my thoughts with you and to champion both social work and social workers who work in this space, and really acknowledge their contribution, and also think about the importance of us all raising our profile as part of this. So again, anything that BASW can do to support this, I think we would all be very grateful for. So just to finish with, really, because I'm really interested in your views and your experiences of working in this area of practice, a bit about the Youth Justice Institute. So the Youth Justice Institute was formed in 2019, so it's relatively new. And the purpose is to bring together key academics. At the moment, it seems to be criminologists, youth workers, but I'm really passionate that we have our social work academics as part of this. So bringing together academics as well as operational organisations. So this is ourselves, to identify and disseminate the latest evidence and research practice to really support practitioners who are working in those front-facing teams. So I'm really keen that BASW joins us. I know I keep saying this, Wayne, as if it's you in your power and gift, but I'm really keen for BASW to be part of the Institute going forward, and for us to really champion and bring together kind of the practice wisdom and the knowledge that's happening on the ground, together with the research evidence too, in an accessible way. So we really are championing acknowledging the challenges that are taking place in this very complex and very specialist area of social work practice.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think it was fantastic in terms of just how comprehensive it was, and I think a lot of people here will be able to relate to that in terms of their knowledge and experience perhaps of youth justice and the direction of travel. I thought it was really interesting what you had to say about the relationship-based practice values and the framework and everything behind that. And I just think that's something that's so important, isn't it, in terms of maintaining that social work kind of influence within youth justice, really, because there is just a real danger of it sliding off the agenda. So thank you again for the presentation. I'd like to invite comments, views and questions now from people that we have within the audience. I can see that we have Kat Brooklyn with her hand up, so I'd like to ask you to turn your camera on. You've done that. Okay, Kat, hello.
Hello, sorry for any background. I'm in the office today. So I am a team leader in a youth justice team in Somerset. This is an absolute passion of mine. I'm a qualified social worker as well. So Heidi, I was kind of nodding along to everything you were saying within your presentation. I think the one thing which I wrote down as I was taking some notes throughout is I've been lucky enough to do the trauma-informed course through Unitas, supported by the Youth Justice Institute. It's a fantastic course. There were a number of free places that were offered out, and it's almost kind of a lottery as to who was able to get those. My real concern is with Child First, and this is the leading principle for youth justice teams now, has very much been done on that basis. The offer has been out of here is a scattering of free places, first come, first served, available to a handful of people within each youth justice teams. And whilst the embedding of the Child First principles is now within case management guidance, is going to be within the new out of court assessment that's coming up in the next few months, the training and the kind of the national push to embed this within all youth justice teams is not there. Yeah. It's really piecemeal in terms of, we've got 3 of our team that were lucky enough to get the free places, and if we want the rest of our team to be Child First trained, which we absolutely do, we now have to pay £250 per head, and there's no funding available for that. It's just got to come out of our budgets already that are already stretched. So I suppose it's more of a statement rather than a question, but I 100% agree. Child First is the way forward. We need to be trauma informed and Child First in our practice. But where is the push nationally in terms of these are the principles, this is what you want to do, and here is the funding and the free training for everybody to embed this. We know that youth justice teams that have embedded it within their strategies, in their youth justice plan, and therefore in their practice, have received outstanding in their inspections, because that's the way we're expected and needed to go.
I would absolutely agree with everything you're saying, Kat, and Yes, and I think that that is a challenge, and that's one of the challenges. And I've spoke to the Youth Justice Board about that. So I sit on a couple of academic panels and one of them is the ideas of child first. And there's that big document that's been produced, hasn't there, which talks about operationalising. This is the operationalising of child first. But actually, what does that really mean for front-facing teams like yourself and the massive challenges around that? Because actually it's not in our gift quite often. Quite often it's further either upstream or before they even get to us that some of those challenges exist. But I absolutely take your point about funding. And I think that's something that we need to be pushing up. We need to be championing and saying to the Association of Yacht Managers and through their links that absolutely we support this 100% in terms of our value base, and that's the way we want to go. But where's your training and infrastructure to support us with that? Because it's okay having the case management guidance, but actually in terms of the systems and processes and the heavy weight of bureaucracy that sits behind that, that's a real challenge. But no, I absolutely hear that and accept that.
Yeah, and as someone who hasn't been fortunate enough to do the child first, I looked and read the new case management guidance when it came out before Christmas and went, oh, this is different.
Yes.
And I don't have the skills and experience in terms of the language and the principles of child first that I'm now going to have to go and find myself to really understand the narrative of the change in the use of the language, and particularly the new out of court assessment that's in trial at the moment, which the expectation is that we all then embed and use within our services. If we don't have our practitioners trained in child first principles, they're using a document they're not qualified to use. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's really interesting. And again, I officially start with the Institute next week, so that would be some of the conversations that I will have. I hear that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, Kat. I can see Brian Littlechild's had his hand patiently raised for some time, so I'll come to Brian next, and we have a few, or at least one question in the chat, which we'll come to after that. So hello, Brian, good afternoon, nice to see you.
Good afternoon, Wayne, thank you. Thank you, Heidi, for a really, really good presentation. So first of all, of course, are you prepared to share those PowerPoints, please, with us once we're finished, which would be kind of nice.
I've got it already, Brian.
You've done, oh, in that case, okay, keep up, Brian, keep up. I actually work in a university now, and some of before I came to university, I worked in youth justice many years ago, and I still do youth offender referral panels. Have been about 20 years, and most recent research has been Youth Endowment Fund on some of the areas of family interventions, and also some work with the Sentencing Council about potential biases in sentencing from sentencers at different levels. But the point I wanted to make was that really good to hear about, as other people are saying, about the themes, about the child first bit, relationship based work. So really good to hear that coming through and gaining traction in many ways. Point really I think I'd like to make is that I'm aware and other people are aware of the fantastic work that social workers do in this area. And I've been thinking it for many years in many areas that we do. We're not very good at putting it out there to people, what we do, why it's important, and some of the outcomes, which are so brilliant. We just heard just now from the speaker asking a question, and I just wonder how we capture that best and make the media and politicians and policymakers more interested and aware of the great work that we do. Because it's not now, it's many. I've been involved in BASW for far too long, but it's always been an issue, and it's a question for us, not for you to solve, Heidi, please, but it's just a general thing for all of us. How do we do that? Because I'm not sure we do it as well. Maybe we do it well, but we don't necessarily have the effect that we want, maybe, in terms of how social work is seen and given credence, really. So I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment or what, really, but anyway, because Wayne might want to say something about that as well, actually, Heidi, in terms of how we might take things forward and other people on the call. That was it. Sorry, thank you.
That was great. Yeah, Heidi, what are your views on that?
Just firstly, thank you for attending, Brian. I've read some of your stuff quite recently, actually. So thank you for being here, as I thank everyone else for being in this space. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Absolutely. I think there's something about social work that's a humble profession anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that we are not used to shouting about ourselves. We're not used to championing ourselves, and particularly so in this. So social work as a whole as a profession, and then particularly so in this area of practice. And I think there are lots of reasons for that, and some of that I think is about professional identity and holding our own within when we're working with those, you know, 4 hard hitters: police, probation, education, and you know, and the whole debate about whether social work is a profession or not. You know, we link into all of those things, but and that's why I think it comes down to each and every one of us, really, you know, our social work values to champion. You know, there used to be that thing, and again, someone was talking about this recently, about when you know, if you're at a party or something where people, you know, will say that they don't say that they're a social worker. Now, I always say I'm a social worker. Are you one of those people? I always say, if someone asks me what I do, I say I'm a social worker.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But
you have different reactions now. I find I have different reactions now than, 40 years ago. And somehow we've got to change that discourse in people's minds, and we've still got a lot of work to do it. And I think, and it's well worth doing, and just need to find better ways of doing it, maybe between us all.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
thank you
for that question, Ryan. And yeah, I would echo what Heidi has said. It is important, I think, to raise the profile of social work, and I think in the digital age we've got maybe more opportunities now than we have previously. And obviously I've not been in social work for as long as yourselves, really, but you know, just during my time it's changed so much. And I think there's new opportunities now to use things like YouTube, which hopefully this recording will go out on. And you have to forgive me, I've got a cold today, so I think I'm sounding especially Yorkshire today for some reason. But yeah, I think there are new ways in which we can kind of raise the profile of the different aspects of the profession. And it is a profession, in my opinion. Yeah, I think you know, the sort of Twitter communities and social media, etc. I think those, as much as they have downsides, there are big opportunities as well, you know, for kind of that community as well as the profile. I don't know if we have any other comments or views around that question from anyone. I can see someone has their hand up. I believe it's Bongane.
Yes, I'm Bongane. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can now.
I'm actually in Durban, South Africa. I'm also quite intrigued, and I was intrigued by the title of the presentation. And thank you so much, Heidi, for your nice and excellent presentation. And I think I've just learned a number of similarities between South Africa and your country, England, in particular, in relation to, we refer to it as child justice, you refer to it as youth justice. And our child justice system in South Africa, it's relatively new in terms of its legislation, because it was legislated in 2008, and the actual implementation started in 2011 of the legislation, the Child Justice Act of 2008. So I'm just noticing when Prof. Brian was saying that he's concerned that the space of youth justice, it's actually how we as social workers are out there. We are not out there or dominant enough or claiming our space. And when I looked at your topic saying that the forgotten social work space, then I realized that no, perhaps we should have said the marginalized space, because similarly, also here in South Africa, also my research, particularly, I did a research on child diversion back in 2017. I discovered that prosecutors or the legal people, they are actually the gatekeepers in whether the diversion is being accepted or not. And the space itself, it's dominated also in the research front. I know that there are a lot of social workers, particularly in Europe, who are writing about child justice and all of that. And I was also intrigued by your framework of 2017. And I think I'm still going to follow that. But the space itself, it's dominated by the voice of criminologists, the voice of law and legal academics and all of it. So our space itself, I know we are doing a lot in terms of practice. Also here in South Africa, there is a growing research and impact in the communities. But in terms of how we then write, how we then market the profession itself in terms of this specialized field. Also in South Africa, the probation services, it's a specialized field. By social workers, you can't be a probation officer if you're not a social worker, if you don't have a degree and a master's or a specialist honors. But the space itself, in terms of how, and also drawing back from my experience, I worked for a couple of years, both initially as a probation officer, as later as a court intermediary. I realized also the gap here in South Africa. I'm not sure on your side, in terms of children who are offenders, who are now running through the criminal trial, those who were not diverted due to the nature of their offenses. They are not afforded the chance of also child protection, child first, in terms of them being offered a court intermediary, not being exposed to the actual court and all of that. So the gap in terms of our advocacy, I think it's still lacking, and I think there's quite a lot of interesting work and a lot of hills that we need to climb as the profession and as social workers. And yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I think I'm still going to follow on your YouTube page as well. I'm glad to know that you also have a YouTube page. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bongane, joining us all the way from South Africa. Glad you got so much from that. Heidi, was there, I know there was a lot that Bongane captured there, but were there any standout bits you'd like to reply to?
I guess it's just so interesting to hear about the differences, but also the similarities that happens within, different policy, different legislation, different nuances, different cultures. But actually, we can talk about those differences. Actually, there still sounds that there's lots of parallels and lots of similarities, and that's what really strikes me around that.
Yeah, especially in terms of the social work values, that it's nice to, in many ways, to know they're global, international. So yeah, excellent. Okay, we've got a question in the chat. Let me just read this. It's from Charlotte Irving. I'm in a busy office or noisy office, so can't put my mic on, but just wanted to explore what I can do as a social worker working with these boys whilst they are imprisoned. Perhaps something you feel is currently missing from this system stroke puzzle. Sorry, very weird. Is the comment she's added at the end. But is there anything that you feel is missing from that puzzle?
Well, yeah, I think there's tons missing. I mean, the care review, very controversial, but the things that the interesting stuff in that was lots of interesting stuff, but the more positive stuff for me in that was around the idea about are not have the only secure establishments that we should have is secure children's homes. And so that was an interesting part of the care review for me that really resonated with me. And of course the government's not going to follow that, and is not responding to that particular thing. So in terms of what's missing from the system, I do think it's those relationships. So I'm currently co-editing a book around relational practice, and I really wanted to chapter around relational practice within secure establishments, and my co-author really struggled with that notion, because he was saying the idea about relational practice under those conditions was just so challenging for him, particularly in the light of the Ofsted inspections that we were having. So in the end, we kind of compromised, and we're doing something, I think, around child's rights within a secure establishment as part of the relational practice. But yes, I guess that's the thing for me. It's about the advocacy. What's missing is about needing to advocate and making sure those children's voices are heard, and actually that we are focusing on what those children who are in prison can become. So not what they've done, but what they can become and what they can be. So I know it sounds really simplistic answer, but it's kind of, it's as simple and as complicated as that, I think, really.
Yeah. And in terms of that gap, in terms of bridging it, is funding the primary issue, do you think, or is it more complicated than that? Is it also about sort of training and resourcing in terms of workforce, etc.?
I think some of that is about political intent, you know, that whole
Yeah.
childism. Children don't vote. So where is their political power? Where is their agency? Again, children in contact with the criminal justice system are, you know, demonized even more. So actually, why put your energies? Why would our government, with all its challenges that it's got currently, you know, Charlie Taylor's review back in the day was quite revolutionary in lots of things. Didn't always agree with everything, but had, you know, secure schools for me was not something that should ever go anywhere. I was more champion secure children's homes, but there were some real aspects in Taylor's report that I thought was really interesting. And then of course we had Brexit, so that just fell by the wayside. No, you know, we've got lots of other more important stuff. So in terms of, you know, champion children's rights who are in this specialist area of practice, thinking about raising the age of criminality, that stuff isn't going to be there. And so for me, that feels even more important, that we need to be championing that and getting behind those things.
I see. Okay, thank you. I noticed that there's been lots that have happened over the last couple of years around different young offender institutes that have highlighted lots of concerns and issues around standards, around you know, real lack of children being first, you know, abuse and so on. I just wondered what your thoughts were around that, in terms of, you know, how do we remedy that? Again, it's not just funding, is it? It's far more complicated than that. And it sounds like some of this is kind of institutional as well. So I just wondered, you know, what your take was on that.
What my take was on that in 3 minutes, Wayne. I could do a couple of hours on that. So succinctly, I think again it's about how we view children. So for me, I think if we need to provide, you know, back in the day there were hundreds and hundreds of children in custody on a daily basis. We've got the lowest numbers of children in custodial settings now, which is a real policy development. That's something to be championed. Still, it's too many. And I think that children should be, if they need to be detained for their own protection or protection of others, they need to be in very small, secure children's homes. That, for me, therapeutic environments, that's the bottom line for me.
Yeah. And thank you. And I suppose from a political point of view, I guess that costs the earth, doesn't it? Really? So it really does require that political intent and motivation. Okay. So I think that gives us some idea of where, as a group of social workers, where we feel the direction of travel needs to go. Thanks ever so much, Heidi. It's been really kind of insightful speaking to you this afternoon and listening to your presentation. I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking you for that. And I can see there's some nice messages in the chat.
Well, and just I feel very privileged to have been invited to share my thoughts with you, and thank you all for attending. I know how busy it is, and also it's lunchtime. So yes, I just wanted to say thank you all for listening and for sharing in our passion in this very specialist area of practice.
Oh, fabulous.